Hello, and welcome to a series called In the Frame. Every episode we will take a different great work from the history of art and examine its story, its context, and analyse its appearance. And I wanted to start this series with a work that I've personally found fascinating for many years. It's an enormous oil painting in the Louvre in Paris. It dates from 1818-1819 by the artist Théodore Géricault, and it's called Raft of the Medusa. When I say enormous, I mean enormous. It's 5 meters by 7 meters, so an extraordinarily huge painting. Fills this wall in the Louvre and looms over you. As I said, by Théodore Géricault, a young French artist. He's only 27 when this painting is completed. Now, to really understand this painting, you have to know the fascinating story behind its creation and behind its subject matter. The story of its subject means we have to go a few years earlier, to 1816, the year after Napoleon's defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. Now, of course, France has gone through a lot of very difficult years. From 1789 onwards, they've had the French Revolution, the execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. They've had the terror of the guillotine and Robespierre. They've had Napoleon Bonaparte becoming emperor, the French Empire, his eventual defeat in 1815 at Waterloo, and then the restoration of the French monarchy. And in its first year of return, 1816, this terrible event happens. Now, the French have sent a fleet of ships to go and recapture some of their colonies in West Africa, namely Senegal. And this fleet are travelling down the coast of West Africa towards Senegal. And the one particular ship, the Medusa, is captained by a chap called Hugh de Roy de Chaumareix, who was appointed by the new French monarchy as a kind of grace and favour appointment. He wasn't really a sailor. He had some experience at captaining ships, but that was 20 years before, and he was essentially an aristocrat. In fact, he was a viscount. But he's put in charge of this ship despite his lack of expertise. And he decides he wants to get to Senegal first, so he sails much closer to the coast of Africa than was really very safe. And just as they're passing modern-day Mauritania, they run aground on a sandbank 30 miles off coast. Now, on this ship, there were 400 people. Most of them were officers of the French Navy or colonial administrators and diplomats. And so they decide, well, the ship's run aground, we need to abandon ship. Let's get in the lifeboats. But in classic Titanic style, of course, there aren't enough lifeboats, so all of the important people get a space in the lifeboat, and they're left with 151 people made up of the crew and passengers who have no space on the lifeboats. So what they do is they hastily construct a raft out of bits of the ship that they tear apart. The raft gets put together by the ship's carpenter very hastily. It's 20 meters by 7 meters, so it's a small raft made of just kind of flotsam and jetsam, all lashed together with rope. And onto this tiny raft, they cram those 151 people. And the idea is that raft will be towed along to safety to the land by the lifeboats. They will row in front and pull the raft behind them. And after a while, they realise that the waves are so high and the raft is so overpacked with people that it risks dragging the lifeboats down into the waves with it. So the lifeboats cut the raft free. They leave it stranded in the Atlantic on its own, with hardly any supplies on board, and as I said, 151 people on it. Now, the raft floats around the Atlantic for 13 days until it's rescued. It's nearly a fortnight until it's rescued. And when they do eventually find the raft, of those 151 people, there are only 15 left alive. Reports from those who are on board start to circulate in the French press afterwards of of murder of some of the officers who were stuck on the raft, killing some of the other passengers for the limited supplies. There's fighting, starvation, illness, and indeed cannibalism is reported between the people on the raft. This story, of course, comes back to France and causes a huge scandal. The new French monarchy is seen to have been responsible for appointing this unqualified captain to be in charge of the ship. And there's a trial, and to make matters worse, it's seen as being a complete whitewash, because the captain, Hugh de Roy de Chaumareix, that aristocrat, he only gets 3 years in jail for his crimes of being incompetent and getting the ship grounded in the first place, but then also making the decision to cut that raft free with all those people on board. So the French public are outraged by this, but as tends to happen with affairs, this scandal kind of boils over, and then people move on. But one man who doesn't move on is the young artist Théodore Géricault. He gets captivated by the story of the Raft of the Medusa, and he decides that if he paints a large painting of this subject, that might be the move that makes his career. And so he begins what is about 18 months of work on this enormous painting. Of those 18 months, only 8 of them are actually spent painting the painting itself. The rest is in research. What Géricault does is look through Paris and indeed the rest of France to try and find any of the survivors who are willing to talk to him, and he finds a few: the ship's surgeon, one of the engineers who was on board, and even the ship's carpenter, a man called Vauvilette. Vauvilette was the carpenter and the man who actually put together the raft while they were out at sea. And he asks Vauvilette to come into his studio and to recreate a scale model, as best as he can remember it, of the Raft of the Medusa on Géricault's studio floor. So he does that. He takes testimony from all of the survivors that he can find. He spends trips on the Channel coast, trying to experience rough seas and to get a sense of the conditions that the raft might have gone through. And particularly, he goes to the morgues of Paris. He goes and examines dead bodies, and he paints and sketches these. And we have quite a lot of these surviving: severed heads, hands and feet, that kind of thing, rotting corpses in different states of decay, because he's really serious about getting an accurate vision of the sheer squalor and horror of the conditions on the raft. And so we have these paintings, as you can see, of these kind of horrendous bits of bodies that he studies. And then eventually he brings all this together, and he gets people to come to his studio, models. He arranges them on the model of the raft. Some of them, the figures who are kind of in the shadowy centre of the painting, are from the people who come and model for it are the survivors of the raft, amazingly. Another one of the models he brings in is his fellow painter and friend Eugène Delacroix, who's most famous for painting the Liberty leading the people some years later. He is supposedly the figure in the middle and the foreground, lying on his front with his arm outstretched. And Géricault works on this painting fanatically in his studio. He dedicates all his time to it, and eventually it's produced and exhibited in the Salon of 1819. Now, the Salon is this large annual exhibition that happens in the heart of Paris, a lot like the summer exhibition at the Royal Academy in London, other than it's all under the purview of the French monarch. And they have complete control over what goes in it. There's a very strict jury that control which art gets selected and included. And if you are featured, you are considered part of the kind of French art establishment. This is where names are made. And so Géricault's painting, this enormous canvas, dominates the exhibition in 1819. And he doesn't call it, as it's known today, Raft of the Medusa. At this exhibition, it's known as simply The Shipwreck. But nobody would have been fooled who saw it in that exhibition what the real subject matter was. It was still very fresh in the mind, the whole scandal of the wreck of the Medusa. And so they would have seen this composition and they would have known exactly what it was they were looking at. And it causes a kind of a scandal of its own. The painting is seen as being this great masterpiece, and the shocking reality of it, the harshness, the revulsion that people feel seeing this scene of tragedy brought right into the centre of genteel Paris, kicks off a whole renewed furore about the scandal that had happened a couple of years beforehand. Previously, people had kind of forgotten about it, and Géricault's painting brings it very, very publicly back into the realm of discussion. What he's done in this exhibition is created this huge canvas, which is normally a format reserved for paintings of great historical scenes from classical antiquity, from ancient Rome, from ancient Greece, or from mythological scenes. But what Géricault has done is produced a contemporary historical image, something from just a few years beforehand, of real people who are still alive in living amongst the Parisians, which is a very, very provocative thing to do. Okay, so I've got the painting here in front of me, although of course a photograph of it on a laptop screen is never going to recreate the real thing, but here we have it, the Raft of the Medusa, and the experience you get as this looms over you in the Louvre in Paris is an extraordinary one. It is as if you are kind of sucked into the events happening in front of you. And Géricault achieves this in a number of ways. Firstly, what he does is make the figures in the foreground, the closest to you, those are larger than life size. They're larger than you are when you're stood in front of the painting. And then the figures towards the back are about life size. So you feel like you are kind of dwarfed by this scene happening around you. It kind of drags you in because these people, you can relate to these people because they're about the same size that you are when you're stood in front of it. The other thing he does is brings the raft in his painting right up to the foreground of the painting. In fact, the nearest corner to you kind of disappears under these little waves in the foreground. So you kind of could walk onto that raft feasibly. It's dragged right in front of you. The rest of the painting is designed around kind of triangular shapes. So you can see one large triangle is made by the ropes that lead up the mast to the sail and down the other side. There is a large triangle. There's another triangle just to the right of that, formed by people, and at the top of that triangle is an African member of the crew who was called Jean Charles, and he was from Senegal, and he survives the raft only to die a few days later, tragically, in hospital. He is at the top of this pyramid of these figures surging up to that pinnacle where he waves round this rag. Notably a red rag, and of course the red flags were associated with kind of revolutionary movements, and so there's always a suggestion there that, you know, the French Revolution is raw in people's minds this time. There's another triangle, if you like, facing downwards, caused by the shape of the raft that comes into the bottom of the painting where you are. So you've got these two triangles pointing upwards and a triangle pointing downwards, setting the scene of the raft. And in the background you have these tumultuous waves. Although there is a slight giveaway that this was painted in a studio with a model of the raft rather than at sea, because the raft seems to sit on this kind of flat surface, this kind of very calm piece of water in front of all these waves in the background. So you get an idea of where the studio floor probably was in Géricault's composition. That being said, it's still an extraordinarily moving and dramatic painting. At the bottom left here you have these two figures who could be possibly a father and a son. One of them, it looks like a very wise man with a kind of beard and this red cloth over his head, and he's clinging on to what appears to be the dead body of a much younger man, and he looks extremely melancholy. He's given up hope. He's looking away from the rest of the group and gazing out at the sea while he clings on to this extraordinarily kind of putrefying dead body, this pale, almost like marble figure. And next to them there's all these bodies lying about in different ways. The figure kind of lurching forward that was supposedly based on Delacroix. To the far left there's kind of half a torso with a head, you can see, which is his legs must have disappeared through a gap in the raft, or possibly his legs are no longer there. They may have been eaten by cannibals on the raft. At the bottom right, you've got this figure covered in a shroud who's fallen backwards off the raft, and his head is either not there or is underneath the waves, so presumably another dead figure. And then to the right you have, as I mentioned, this surge of characters rising up towards the figure at the top of the pyramid, and they are all reaching out in hope, because just in the distance you can see, just on the horizon, there's a tiny sail of a ship, and that is supposedly their saving grace. That is the ship which will eventually find them after 13 days and save them from their fate out at sea. And you can see there's a smaller group in the background also referencing towards this tiny ship which will come and save them ultimately. In the background you've got this billowing sail suggesting the wind of the sea, and this dramatic sky with this sunset glowing in the background. All of this is part of a style of the period which is known as Romanticism. It's a romantic painting. Now, I'll do a separate video talking all about Romanticism and exactly what it means, but for now, let's take it as being a style of art which is concerned with emotion and with excitement and with drama and with an element of horror. It's all about the sublime, which is a key kind of art historical idea, which we'll look at again in future. But this idea of the sublime having an element of horror in it, that we are overawed by terrible things. And the story of the Raft of the Medusa is about as terrible as it gets, all of these deaths at sea and this horrible, completely avoidable disaster. So here you have the sublime horror of it all represented in this beautiful romantic painting. The colours of rich reds and kind of strange off blues and whites that give that kind of odd rotting flesh kind of feeling to it. There's an eerie light to the whole scene. In terms of inspiration, I would argue there's a certain line between Michelangelo back in the 1500s and the beginning of the 19th century here with Géricault, because if we were to look at Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, that great painting on the east wall of the chapel below his famous ceiling, you have in the bottom right hand corner the figure of people being dragged into hell. They're being pulled into hell and they're being pulled off this ship, the ferryman's ship across the river Styx, and they're being dragged into hell. And the composition and the form is very similar to Géricault's here in this painting. Indeed, Géricault had been to the Sistine Chapel in Rome in the years just before beginning this project. He'd seen the works of Michelangelo, and he writes in his diary how revolutionary he'd found them and how impressed he'd been by them. So we can find the direct line of his inspiration right there. So I hope you've enjoyed looking into The Raft of the Medusa by Théodore Géricault with me. If you'd like to see more of these videos, then please like, subscribe, leave a comment with some feedback or a work of art, a painting, a sculpture or a building that you'd like to see. And I hope to see you in the next video.